Hello everyone, hope you're all good. So today we're going to actually continue from our previous video which we done about Maryam al-Asrulabiyya appearing in Vikings Valhalla Season 2. We're going to zoom out a bit and talk about a broader topic of Viking and Arab interactions in the early Middle Ages. So let's get straight into it. Before we start, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button and please also give this video a like. It helps the channel grow. Thank you very much. Right, Arabs, Vikings, medieval times. Did they interact? Did they meet face to face? What was it like? Well, a key personality I want to introduce today is Ahmad Ibn Fadlan. He had an interesting point of view about what he saw from the Vikings. But we'll speak about that at the end, so make sure you watch the video and stay until the end. Let's start talking about Viking and Arab interactions in a more general way. So how did the relationship between the Arabs and the Vikings start? Well, it's an interesting one, and it was a very, very turbulent one as well. Because what happened is that the Vikings sailed from Brittany in 844 AD towards Spain. So they sailed south, and they wanted to raid the riches and the treasures of the Islamic and Arab Caliphate because it was known to be so wealthy and extravagant, and Baghdad at that time was the center of intellectual development and was one of the greatest cities alongside Constantinople. But the Muslim and Arab Empire reached to modern day Cordoba, which was Al-Andalus. The Vikings wanted to go there to do what they were the best at doing, which was raids, conducting raids, and they actually even settled where they used to raid. A good example was England, and we all know what happened with Danelaw. Vikings started sailing south, and they did manage to reach Spain and raid it alongside Seville. But then when they reached Al-Andalus, this is where they faced a fierce opposition. The Vikings weren't expecting it. They were the dominant power when it came to fighting on the sea. No one was able to stand in their way. They were fierce warriors, but the Muslim armies resisted. They managed to push the Vikings back, and this sent shockwaves, right? Because the Vikings were like, what the hell's going on? We weren't able to break through. And at the same time, the Muslims were now very, very cautious and curious. Who are these Northmen? They used to refer to them as the Northmen. Who are they? They are now another military threat for us. So this curiosity and enmity started to develop, and it actually reinforced what the Arabs used to think of Northmen and Europeans in general as uncivilized people, because at that time, in the Arabs' eyes, the civilized places and nations, if you'd like to say, were Islamic Caliphate, Byzantium, India, and Persia. The rest were just irrelevant. As you can see, it wasn't off to a good start. They were fighting each other. But the Vikings didn't want to give up, and they really wanted to get their hands on the Caliphate's treasure. 859 AD, the Vikings tried again, and they actually managed to penetrate the Muslim defenses and loot the treasures of Al-Andalus, and they regarded it as a successful mission. But then here's the fascinating part. On their way back from Al-Andalus, the Muslims followed them, and they managed to destroy more than half their fleet. And what's even more fascinating is that the Vikings had so much loot in their ships. Sources say that their ships were actually starting to sink whilst they were sailing. They were like almost halfway into the water. This is how much treasure they managed to capture, but then it all went to waste because the Muslims followed them and destroyed more than half their fleet. As you can see, it's a rough start between 844 and 859 AD. So when did trade and more civil interactions start? What happened is the Vikings settled around the Volga River, which became known as Rus, modern day Russia. When the Vikings started to settle around the Volga River, they became known as the Varangians, and that's how the Slavs referred to them, and they were the local population. It's good to note that the Swedish Vikings actually already had pre-existing relationships with Arab merchants via the Caspian Sea, so this already started to begin. And once they settled around the Volga River, this would set the foundation between the interaction of Arabs and Vikings in the early Middle Ages. and it mostly happened in Constantinople, which was a powerful international trade center. And this is where the Vikings realized they could gather their riches in trade. And it's also where they started to meet Arab merchants and trade goods. But they were very, very highly valued by the Byzantine Empire. Byzantium regarded Vikings as ferocious fighters on the battlefield. They were extremely strong and extremely loyal. So what happened is the Vikings started to build very, very good relationships with Byzantium. The Vikings were hired by Byzantium to fight in their wars. There is one famous Viking called Harald Sigurdsson, who actually appeared in Vikings Valhalla Season 2. Thought I'd mention that. And he was one of the most famous Vikings that fought for Byzantium in Africa and in the Middle East. And he managed to gather so much gold and so much resources because of his military service. And eventually he went back to Scandinavia to reclaim his crown. Going back to our topic, the relationship between Vikings and Byzantium was very, very healthy and very fruitful. Byzantium employed them to fight, and in return they received wages. And on top of that, their merchants had some special sort of regulations for them, which allowed them to come and settle in Constantinople and trade freely with minimal restrictions. This happened in 907 AD, so the Vikings had a lot of commercial interests in Constantinople, and it's when they started to also trade with Arabs. They realized that raiding Arab and Muslim lands wasn't feasible for them. They were better off trading in Constantinople. When they traded with the Arab merchants, they got their hands on the finest silk and textiles that you can find, on gold and silver. And it was very important for Vikings that they got their hands on silver. And then on the other hand, the Arab and Muslim merchants traded and received fur and weapons from Vikings. So it was a mutually beneficial relationship. And this is how they interacted with each other. And they saw each other's cultures and each other's traditions. And it was the Vikings' demand for silver which really influenced them to build those commercial contacts from Rus to Constantinople, especially with the Arabs. And as you can see, what started off from skirmishes and battles became a healthy trading relationship. And now we'll get to the interesting part about Ahmad Ibn Fadlan and what he said and saw from the Vikings. So, Ahmad Ibn Fadlan was the assistant to the ambassador of the Abbasid Caliph. Ahmad Ibn Fadlan was sent by the Caliph to the King of Bulgars as a sort of diplomatic mission and a emissary in order to teach the Bulgars the Islamic religion, because Ahmad Ibn Fadlan was a scholar in Islamic jurisprudence, and the King of Bulgars, who recently converted to Islam, wanted to teach his people the proper way. And on top of that, he wanted all the gifts and the riches that came from aligning yourself with the Arab Caliphate at the time. So Ahmad Ibn Fadlan went to the King of Bulgars, and on his journey when he arrived, this is where he encountered the Rus, or the Vikings that settled around the Volga River. They still refer to them as the Northmen. And what Ahmad Ibn Fadlan saw was bizarre. Alright, it was something completely different, something they were not exposed to at all. And it's actually quite interesting what he says about the Vikings. What he observes about the Vikings of Russia included things like him being very, very disgusted with their way of life. And I was actually going through his chronicle, and he mentioned things like their hygiene. Right, they used to go to the toilet or do a number two, do their business, and then they wouldn't wash or wipe afterwards. Right, as you can see, that's a big problem and a big concern for him. He also said things like their slaves would bring them buckets of water in the morning. They would wash themselves and then spit in the bucket of water, and then that same bucket would be taken to another Viking and he'd do the exact same thing. And it would just go around with every single man washing and spitting in the same water. He also said that after they'd have sexual relations, they wouldn't bathe themselves. So he was so shocked and disgusted, he referred to them as the filthiest creatures of God. Consequently, this reinforced the idea the Arabs and Muslims had about the Vikings being uncivilized people. On the contrary, there are certain aspects he admired about them and certain positives he mentioned, such as the Vikings being very, very strong, very well-built men, very strong and very tough fighters. They were in brilliant shape. Obviously, this is not surprising considering how much Byzantium valued them and their military service. And what shocked Ahmad ibn Fadlan the most was a funeral that happened for a Viking. Once he died, he saw a slave woman, if I'm not mistaken, going around sleeping with all the other Vikings and then killing herself next to the dead Viking who was her master or her husband. I'm not too sure. This was the funeral process he was describing. And at the end, they'd let them sail in a boat and then burn them. Obviously, I'm not too sure if that's 100% accurate or if that's how Vikings conducted their funerals. Obviously, when it comes to Viking portrayal in TV, there's a lot of misconceptions, and I'm not really that well versed when it comes to Viking history. But this is something that really shocked Ahmad ibn Fadlan, and actually it's a very interesting insight he gave on the Rus Vikings. So here's your answer. The Vikings and the Arabs did have a lot of interaction, especially when it came to trade. They exchanged so many goods and had a mutually beneficial commercial relationship, all thanks to Constantinople, even though they got off to a bad start when they had a few skirmishes in Al-Andalus. Anyways, if you enjoyed the video, please make sure you give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. It really helps and goes a long way. And we will see you again very soon.